The Book of Genesis by Robert S. Candlish, Chapter 10. The New World in its three departments of nature, providence, and grace. 1. The Law of Nature. Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. Quote, "Every creature of God is good, and nothing to be refused, if it be received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God and prayer." End quote. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. The law of nature is the rule which God has appointed for the preservation of life on the earth. It embraces all the arrangements, whether physical or moral, which are necessary for that end. At first, that law was very simple. It was materially affected, however, by the fall, and it was subjected to still further modifications after the flood. In its original simplicity, the law of nature provided for the increase of the earth's inhabitants, for man's dominion over the other animals, and for the supply of food. And these three objects it attained by the most suitable and effectual means: the distinction of the sexes, the native superiority of mind, and the spontaneous fertility of the ground. Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 to 30. The form of expression in the first announcement of this law at the creation remarkably corresponds with what is said on the renewal of it after the flood. In both instances, it is ushered in by a benediction. Quote, "The Lord blessed them." End quote. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Quote, "The Lord blessed Noah." End quote. Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. Then, having thus generally given his blessing, thereby consecrating to his own the law or rule which he is about to institute, the Lord proceeds to lay down more particularly the details of his plan. The plan is, I repeat, very simple. It provides first for the propagation of life, and appoints the same rule, in the same terms, for the inferior animals, Genesis chapter 1, verse 22, and for man, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Quote, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." End quote. Afterwards, that rule, as applicable to man, is more precisely and particularly explained, and takes the form of the ordinance of marriage, Genesis chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. Next, for the protection of life and the safety of the earth's increasing population, the plan had in it a rule of order and subordination. Man, having the image of God, was to reign, as in God's stead, over all things here below, by the native superiority of intelligent mind, and by the influence of benefits conferred. While he restrained and commanded the creatures, he was to love, protect, and caress them. This was all the government that the yet unfallen world needed: God supreme over man, man supreme over the other animals. Lastly, for the support of life and the sustenance of earth's teeming tribes, the Lord appointed the simple food which, as the God of nature, he bounteously furnished. The ground, as yet uncursed, grudged not the supplies which the creatures needed. With unstinted and spontaneous prodigality, the Mother Earth was to nourish from her own bosom all her children. After the fall, the law of nature, in all its parts, is very considerably modified. The ordinance of marriage is still holy, but the sorrow of the woman, greatly multiplied, is the token that, while human life is to be thus propagated, it is not now propagated in innocency, but in hereditary guilt and woe. For the safety and protection of life, a new element of government and order is introduced. It is the subordination of the woman to her husband, and the consequent establishment of domestic rule. Law becomes indispensable, and power to enforce law. The husband and father become a head and lord. Formerly, the dominion of man over the creatures sufficed for every purpose of social harmony and security. Now there must be the dominion of man over his fellows, and that dominion begins in the family. The husband is the first king. Finally, as to the sustentation of life, the earth now yields her produce reluctantly, and hard toil becomes the lot of man. The decree goes forth, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. The law of nature, or of the preservation of life, as renewed after the flood, receives several new modifications. In its first branch, indeed, it is identical with what it was before. Life is to be propagated, and living creatures are to fill the earth. The mode of increase in each several kind remains, and the ordinance of marriage stands in all respects unchanged. But there is a considerable alteration in reference to the second. Man receives a new power over the other animals, and has a new power set up over himself. The power, in both instances, is based on terror, but it is a terror necessary and salutary. Man's dominion over the creatures is henceforward to rest mainly on fear and dread. Quote, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth." End quote. Verses 2 and 3. Originally, as it would seem, man's dominion was of a milder character. He ruled more by an influence of love, a good understanding, as it were, prevailing between him and his harmless subjects. By his kind demeanour and his erect and noble bearing, he could sufficiently control them. But when sin marred the impress of his mental and moral majesty, and disturbed his friendship with the creatures under his sway, the very familiarity to which they were accustomed may have tended to introduce danger and disorder. His authority based on love being shaken, who shall say what part his once willing and obedient subjects may have had in the violence with which the earth was filled? Something like that is, perhaps, referred to in this very passage, when God, announcing what is henceforth to be the doom of murder, speaks as if beasts as well as men had been implicated in the antediluvian bloodshed. Quote, "Surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it," end quote, as well as, quote, "at the hand of man," end quote, verse 5. After the flood, at any rate, man's command over the creatures is not simply restored, but placed on a firmer footing. God inspires them with a dread of man. This instinctive fear has ever since characterized all nature's tribes, not the weak and timid only, but the savage and ferocious also. Occasionally, indeed, it is changed by circumstances into the rage of hunger, or revenge, or despair, but still it easily regains its habitual sway, and subjects them, in spite of all their strength and cunning, to their appointed master, either as servants or as victims, either to be tamed or to be conquered, to do his work or to be put out of his way. Such is now man's dominion over the creatures, a dominion painful in itself and apt to be abused, bearing but two plain marks of that vanity under which, for man's sin, quote, "the whole creation groaneth and travaileth together." End quote. Still, it is in mercy that God has rendered man thus formidable to the other dwellers on this earth. It is no enviable power, when rightly viewed, which he wields, but, such as it is the gift of God. It is the pledge, moreover, of his great plan of ultimate redemption. That man is still lord of this lower world, in any sense, and under whatever disadvantages, is the result of the covenant of grace and the mediation of Christ. Psalm 8, Hebrews chapter 2. And the fact that he is so even now gives assurance of the day when, in the terms of that covenant, the meek shall inherit the earth and all the creatures shall be at peace. Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. But not only is there a new power given to man over the creatures, there is new power set up over man himself. The power of the sword is instituted, and it is given into the hand of the magistrate. This is implied in the announcement which God makes of his determination to suppress violence, and to do so by the agency of a human arm. Quote, "At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man." End quote. Verses 5 to 6. Thus, quote, "the powers that be are ordained of God." End quote. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. The magistrate has here his divine sanction, For this is not a mere acknowledgment of the instinct of private vengeance, far less a vindication or justification of it. It unquestionably refers to public judicial procedure and places a high responsible power in the hands of the ruler of the people. For the protection of life, he is to hold the sword, nor is he to hold it in vain. He is to be a terror to evildoers. The government which was appointed after the fall and vested in the husband or the head of each house or family bore the character of domestic discipline, or of that mild authority which is exercised in laying down rules for the order of a household and inflicting occasional correction for the good of its offending members. It had nothing in it of a punitive or penal jurisdiction, properly so called, and apparently it comprehended no power of life and death. On the contrary, we have seen, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that the punishment of death, even for the crime of murder, was suspended or kept in abeyance by the express command of God in the world before the flood. The experiment, as it were, was then tried of subjecting mankind to the least possible amount of coercion and restraint. And, alas, it miserably failed. Quote, "The earth was filled with violence." End quote. Now, therefore, a new kind of government is to be introduced. There must be a sterner rule than the mere discipline of home. Society must be more thoroughly organized and compacted. Law must speak with a more peremptory voice, and power must enforce with a higher hand the sanctions of law. Especially, and by all means, life must be preserved. The sentence of death for death must be recorded, and the sword must be unsparingly used against the murderer. Such is the divine warrant for capital punishment, very express and clear, but at the same time very limited. It is indeed true that this announcement in the verse before us is to be understood as virtually embodying the great charter of all civil magistracy, and sanctioning generally the exercise of that kind of power, of which capital punishment is the extreme infliction. It is to this charter, doubtless, among others, that the Apostle Paul appeals when he lays down the Christian doctrine respecting the power of civil rulers and the subjection due to them, especially when he speaks of them as, quote, bearing the sword, end quote, and as being, quote, God's ministers to execute wrath, as avengers upon him that doeth evil, end quote. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 4. But it is to be observed that the case of murder is here very particularly specified, and the case of murder alone, as the only crime for which that particular punishment of death is actually prescribed. The murderer, to the exclusion of all other offenders, is marked out for execution. By fair analogy, this may be held to warrant the visiting of all sorts of offences, not merely with salutary chastisement and corrective discipline, but with penal severities. But this precise kind of severity, the taking away of life, is of such a nature that it can scarcely be extended beyond the explicit declaration of God himself, the only Lord of life. The magistrate may not inflict death on any criminal without the command of God, but having God's command, he may not suffer the criminal to live. Here, therefore, we have the divine statute of capital punishments for the world at large, a statute altogether distinct from the provisions of the Jewish law, in which God, as himself the immediate sovereign of that people, in the exercise of his absolute prerogative, subjected other crimes to the same doom. The original statute remains in force, independently of any special and temporary enactments, as binding upon all governments ordained by God. The murderer must die by the hand of the magistrate, and except the murderer, none else. This view is confirmed by what precedes, and what follows the ordinance in question. In what goes before, God intimates his fixed determination to make inquisition for blood, verse 5. He resolves, as it were, himself to look more strictly after the commission of this crime, and to see that it shall be visited more promptly than had been the case before. The murderer is no longer to experience so much of his forbearance as in the past, for life, human life, is very precious in his sight. Even a beast that slays a man is not excused. The violence which filled the old world must be effectually restrained. God, therefore, he must be taken and unhesitatingly put to death. Such is the divine purpose, and in fulfillment of that purpose, God demands the cooperation of human governments. He himself undertakes, as it were, for the discovery of the murderer, and then he gives him over to the civil magistrate to be slain. That is the agreement which the God of heaven makes with the powers which he has ordained on earth. He fails not in doing his part. For is it not notorious and proverbial that, quote, murder will out, end quote? Divine justice, in the dealings of providence, dogs the heels of the shedder of blood, and hunts him down, until his crime is brought to light, and either some, quote, damning proof, end quote, or confession wrung out of the agony of remorse discloses the criminal. Woe be to man if he abuses his trust when God has done his part, if either not inflicting death at all, or inflicting it too frequently and indiscriminately for crimes of every dye, he makes void that stern and unrelenting ordinance of God which, isolating from all else this one enormity of bloodshed, devotes and consecrates to it alone, and to it without fail, the doom of the accursed tree, the malefactor's death of shame. In what follows, also, God still further explains and enforces this ordinance by the reason which he assigns for it. The life of man is to be thus guarded by so terrible a sanction, because God made man in his own image. Verse 6. It is true that the image is marred, but it is not marred beyond remedy. In every living individual, it either is already or may be restored. Therefore, every living individual is of inestimable value, and his life, viewed in the light of heaven and eternity, is beyond all calculation important. How precious, when thus regarded, is man, simply as man. How undeniable his claim, not only to protection at the hand of his fellows, but to all good offices. Here is one, a unit in the mighty mass of this world's crowded throng, one of many millions. What is he, that his fellows should go out of their way to notice him? Of what account is he, that all mankind should be obliged to give heed to him? If he were lost, what matters it? A single grain of sand on the seashore is displaced. A drop of water from the ocean is a-missing. Such is the measure which infidelity would take of man, of the individual man. And so measuring him, what wonder if, instead of avenging slaughter, it slays men by thousands? What have conquerors, monarchs, and statesmen to do with individuals? Their movements are on a great scale. Why should they turn aside when I meet them, or pause to raise me when I fall? This single sentence, what a change it makes! Quote, in the image of God created he man. End quote. This man, this particular man, myself for instance, or my outcast brother. This is man's indefeasible charter, making the person of the meanest as sacred as any king's. Challenging for him, be he poor as Lazarus, respect, reverence, regard. Let Christian magistrates and Christian people look to him, not merely to require his blood if he be slain, but to do him good while he is alive. At any rate, let them see to it that whosoever sheddeth his blood shall have his own blood shed in righteous retribution. There yet remains the third branch of this law of nature to be considered, the provision made for the support of life. In this article, a very important change takes place at the flood, animal food being then, for the first time, granted for the use of man. Quote, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. End quote. Verse 3. The grant of animal food has a restriction imposed upon it. Quote, flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. End quote. Verse 4. This prohibition was probably intended to guard against certain horrors which prevailed when the earth was filled with violence, as well as to prevent wanton cruelty in slaying animals for food, and ensure that, previously to their being used, they shall not be tortured or mangled, but put to death in the same orderly way as when their life was taken for an atonement for sin. A similar, but more precise injunction against the eating of blood was subsequently enacted in the Jewish law, and it was enforced by the Jews on their Gentile proselytes among some other precepts ascribed by them to Noah, and considered to be binding, apart from their national and ceremonial institutions. These last, it would seem, they did not require all converts from heathenism to observe, but abstinence from the eating of blood was understood to be binding upon all. This may partly explain the sanction which the Jerusalem Council gave to the rule, in their judgment on the question submitted to them by the Gentile church at Antioch. Acts chapter 15, verse 29. How far any such precept is applicable to Christians of subsequent ages, we need not now inquire. The prohibition in the Levitical Code was undoubtedly connected with the rite of sacrifice, the blood being reserved exclusively for the purpose of expiation. That reason will not apply now, when blood is no longer shed for that end, and it is by no means clear that this noetic rule is the same as that afterwards enacted in the Mosaic ritual. It does not appear to have any religious meaning. On the contrary, it seems merely for the prevention of cannibal ferocity and wanton cruelty, and this view of it is made nearly certain if we consider the relation which it bears to the general denunciation of bloodshedding. God speaks as the preserver of man and beast. He gives the beasts into the hands of man, but it is with the limitation of his power over their lives to the strict necessity of finding food, just as he gives man into the hands of his fellows, with the corresponding limitation of their power over his life to the single case of murder. If life is to be taken, the life of a beast or the life of a man, it must be exclusively for the end which God ordains, with no aggravation of needless severity and no accompaniments of rude or wild barbarity. Such is the law of nature, or economy of life, as appointed by God for the world after the flood. It is, in part, a discipline of severity, but it is to be viewed chiefly as a provision of mercy. It does not touch any of the endearments or refinements of social intercourse, as based upon the pure and peaceful affections of home. Men are still to dwell in families, and in families they are to fill and occupy the earth. But the dangers to which human society was exposed from the fearless familiarity of the subject animals and the growing anarchy of mere domestic rule are to be remedied by the dread of man being forced upon the beasts, and by the sword of magisterial authority being raised in terror against evildoers. And to meet the accumulating difficulty of obtaining supplies from the earth alone, the use of animal food is allowed. Then, to guard against the abuse of these beneficent arrangements, the sword of the magistrate is ordained to be used always for the protection of the life of man, and with a reverential respect to the image of God which man bears. And even the beasts given to man for food are to be the object of a certain scrupulous care. They are not to furnish a bloody meal. They are to be so treated as to preclude the infliction of needless pain, and prevent any harm which the sanguinary use of them might cause. How admirable is the wisdom of God, how great his goodness, in ordering the constitution even of a fallen world. How manifold are the provisions of his care and kindness for alleviating the ills which sin has caused. Far from leaving us to spend at random the season of his forbearance, as instinct or passion might blindly prompt, God establishes a rule or system, whose salutary operation, even those who continue to set at naught its gracious design, are compelled practically to feel. It is that system, based on the principles of holy marriage, of lawful magistracy, and of laborious mastery over the soil that is to be cultivated, and the animals that may be slain for food, which alone hinders the globe from becoming a scene such as devils, and none but devils, could delight to witness. It is true that no mere external arrangements can of themselves secure the present or final welfare of any of Noah's children, and all such arrangements are liable to perversion and abuse. Still, without their due observance, life is but a compound of license, disorder, and precarious subsistence or pining famine. Purity, peace, and plenty flourish in any community, mainly in proportion as these ordinances are honoured and obeyed, and they place each individual man in the best possible position for escaping, through grace, the corruption that is in the world through lust, and laying hold on the blessed hope of everlasting life, to which, by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, believers are begotten again.